This is how dual coding can help us organize our ideas. Each slide I'm going to show without the words, because otherwise we'll have this pattern where I show the slide and I have to be silent so I don't read the words at the same time as you. So here's the intention of our session today. Obviously it sounds bonkers, doesn't it? Ideas are objects, where they're not objects. By the end, I think I'm hoping I've persuaded you it's a really useful way to look at ideas. We have 3 sections, and I'll let you know what the aim for section number 1 is. Section number 1 and 3 are really practical. It's the stuff you're familiar with. I'll tell you why research talks about what the wrong visual is, and the section 3 will be really practical solution, and it will contain a test. I want you to know whether you've got it or not. And the second section is something completely different. It'll be unfamiliar. I'm going to ask you to bear with me because it will bear fruit. It'll be really practical. But first of all, session number 1. Okay. Now, the wrong visuals, because Ruth Colvin Clark, who wrote a book on evidence-based training that was quite popular a couple of years ago, and Tripita Lyons, look at cognitive science with regards to dual coding or dual mode or multimedia learning, whichever terms you prefer. And this is what they have found in their survey of studies. And indeed, they found that the biggest reason why teachers don't achieve the kind of impact they could using visuals and words is that they choose the wrong graphic organizer. They choose the wrong graphic organizer. So here straight away, I'm going to put you into a kind of a test inquiry situation. I'm going to show you 3 graphic organizers. Here they are. And I want you to select 2 that you consider to be the most alike. So pair up 2. It's got, just to let you know, it's got nothing to do with the content. So these 3 were Olympic medal winners in 2012. Maybe you saw them live. So it's got nothing to do with the content. It's to do with the graphic organizer, the way we organize. And I'll show you them big, just in case that's too small and you're on a small screen. So here's number 1. Usain Bolt, have a quick scan. What do you notice? Were we together live, I'd be asking you, after we'd shown you all 3, what reasons do you have for having selected the 2 to pair up? And number 3. So they all contain information about these 3 Olympic medal winners. Which 2 are most familiar? Let me tell you, because we're not able to interact live like this. Let me tell you what normally a lot of people say, and I have deliberately tried to trick you. The secret is not to be affected by surface graphic features. So I've tried to trick you because number 1 and number 3, that is not the answer, are alike for the salient features, that the words are encased within a container and the links are straight lines. The 2 that are most alike are number 2 and number 3, even though they look least alike, because what they are is a hierarchy. In fact, I did this exercise in a comprehensive, a secondary school in Birmingham, and there was a member of the IT department, and he just had the most elegant response I've ever heard. Number 1's a network, 2 and 3 are hierarchies, and that's the answer. So number 1 is kind of linked by association, and numbers 2 and 3 is by a hierarchy. So this kind of reveals, particularly had we had a discussion about the reasons for it, whether you're looking at surface features or whether you're looking at structure. So structure reveals the organization. Now, Federick Reif, who spent 4 decades looking at this area, wrote a book. I mean, the title said, Applying Cognitive Science to Education. This is what he says about organization. So organization is pretty key. There's There's not a lot of learning without organisation. And normally we talk about organisation in kind of lower order forms. That's to say, children to turn up on time, have the correct uniform, have the correct equipment. I'm talking about cognitively organising information. He provides us with a hierarchy of ways to organise. So here is the lowest order, which is random, just random. And then the higher order, but not the highest order, is a list. And I'm going to make a comment about knowledge organisers now, because knowledge organisers are lists. And yet that comes lower down the order of how to organise. So I think knowledge organisers have been great, but I think they've been over-trumpeted with the word organiser because they don't do much organising. They're still essential, however. My view now, considering it for a number of years, is that knowledge organisers provide the ingredients, and ingredients on their own, without a recipe, just their ingredients. There's no connection. They don't interact with each other. So we'll see how that can happen with our next structure. It's a network. And in some ways, networks are very accurate because they show us all the potential links there are between items. But the trouble is they're so idiosyncratic that in terms of efficiency for memory, Federick Reif says they're quite inefficient because each bundle has to be recognized and identified and retrieved as an individual conglomeration. The most effective is a hierarchy, a tree diagram. Whether it's drawn top down or whether it's drawn radiantly as a mind map or whatever you want to call it, is hierarchical. And the reason why it's most effective is that particularly when you include the students in its construction, and you can build such a construction top down deductively or bottom up inductively, then you only need know the top part and the rest of it comes as one go. It's stuck, it's nested knowledge, it's grouped together. It's very effective. So that kind of just gives you a hint about the idea why the wrong sort of organizer is chosen, because, to repeat, because of its surface features, or it's because your favorite. Let me just finish off with that. I used to have teachers come to me on course and say that such and such a graphic organizer is my favorite. And I was struggling to find a polite way to respond to that. Because it's bonkers, let's face it. You know, it's like me turning up to a building site, having a kit bag, which is empty apart from one tool, and I bring it out and I gormlessly say, I like chisels. So that's ludicrous because the tool I choose will be dependent upon the task and the materials I'm going to be working with. Similarly so with graphic organizers. You need to, it all stems from the curriculum content and the type of knowledge and the type of question. And then you choose your tool. And that's exactly the test we're going to finish off with this morning. But now I want to invite you to come with me in this section, which is going to be unfamiliar to you. I want to invite you to stay with it, as implausible, as abstract, as disconnected to your classroom experience as it may sound. I promise you, if you stick with it, I found it enormously powerful. So this is what it's about. So those of you who've been on my course will remember that I immerse you when I first start in this activity where there's a teacher, there's a screen, and in pairs, one of you looks at the screen and one of you doesn't. And the person without the screen is incredibly at a disadvantage. But this is what we discover. The top half of my diagram shows dual coding theory as Pivot researched. It's very simple. You know, you link a word, you link an image, it gets bonded together. So it has it's double-barreled learning, as Professor Paul Kirshner calls it. Therefore, it doubles the chance of retrieval. And he only ever worked with cognitively unchallenging material, did Pivot. So it's useful, but I mean, you know, as they say in Essex, it's not all that. There's not much else to say about it. But this is story number one, as I've decided. This is story number one. It's a verbal and a visual. It could be other sensory format, but we're concentrating on the visual. It's story number two that becomes really important. Now, Pivot wrote about this, but he didn't experiment on it. And it has the most impact for daily classroom teaching. And this is story number two. that was developed by Larkin and Simon in '87, where he gave different groups of people a piece of text or diagram, and they tested their comprehension and retrieval. And those with a well-formed diagram performed significantly better. And the reasons were that the information, the structure of verbal information and visual information differs. Obviously, verbal is linear and visual is non-linear. And it's this non-linear aspect which I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of my session today. And Pavio uses a kind of a strange word, synchronous processing. He sometimes calls it parallel processing, because he says all the elements of a diagram are simultaneously available. Not that you can process all of it in one go, but it is simultaneously available. Whereas with written or spoken word, you have to go backwards and forwards and navigate it with syntax, which is harder. And so he came up with the notion of the visual argument, where diagrams are said to have computational advantage over text. This is what we're going to explore now. And it's the visual spatial part, it's the spatial aspect which really gives us access. So I don't think there's any doubt that using visuals or diagrams is really effective. So we know that it's true. But I've become over the years increasingly frustrated because I haven't read any satisfactory explanation as to why it's more effective. Simon and Larkin's notion of computational efficiency, where information is easier to identify and therefore inference is easier and more efficient, is a really good start, but it's not totally satisfactory. That's what the talk here on in addresses. So I want to show you, first of all, two diagrams which are accessible with people of little or no sight. They're embossed. Essentially, they access the same thing that you and I do with our sight, but their efforts, their routes of access is far harder. They have to work harder because they're accessing it purely spatially through their senses. But this, by showing you, I hope that we emphasize the second part. It's the spatial aspect, which we access via our visual faculties. And it's not the visual faculties which is most important, it's the spatial faculties. And so, I'm sorry, those of you great followers, I'm going to say Captain Kirk got it completely wrong. Space is our first frontier. So we're going to explore this theory now. And I'm going to introduce Malcolm Gladwell, who many of you will know. He said something that I'm going to put a little twist to. We're also busy. We don't have time to put everything we know together into a coherent story to create an organized pattern. I'm going to suggest as a question, not as an assertion, that maybe it could be useful for us to consider that we're now in a position in education where we're becoming perhaps evidence-rich and theory-poor. So here's my dive. Stay with, this is the most complex part. There is a saying in Japan, which is that if you want to know about water, you don't ask fish. I know it's crazy, they can't speak. So here's the reason why you don't ask fish about water, because all they know is water. And so for fish, there is no water. Water doesn't occur, it doesn't happen to them, because the whole universe, as far as a fish is concerned, is water. But you take a fish out of water, and for the first time, it experiences not water. And in experiencing not water, it has this epiphany and looks back and goes, oh man, that was water I was swimming in. So I'm introducing you this because I'm going to show you what I think is the water that you've been swimming in, that you're so immersed in, it's so entrenched, it's so within you, you've never got outside the bowl and seen, oh wow, that's what I was swimming in, cognitively speaking. And this water is metaphors. 1981, these guys, George Lakoff is a linguist and Mark Johnson is a philosopher. He now calls himself a cognitive philosopher. And they wrote a book, Metaphors We Live By, and it hasn't died. It's so resonant. And it may seem if it was far away from the world of schools or cognitive psychology, cognitive science particularly, but look what happened last year. John Sweller wrote this. he wrote a review of cognitive load theory, and in it he explained how he now has to include embodied cognition, which itself was a whole discipline that's born entirely from this book, and acknowledged in the academic papers. This isn't new, there is a history to this, and indeed in Alan Pivio's 1990 book called Mental Representations, he pointed out the very same thing that I showed you on the diagram. The bottom half, story number 2, is a continuation, and Pivio was really aware of what was happening. You know, the empiricists were having an argument, and actually they were discussing with human beings, but later on you'll see it happened. We had the same thoughts with rats and mice in mazes. Do ideas come one after the other as we express them and read them, or internally do they form and associate and connect in a different way? So it's simultaneous as in non-linear, or is it successive and linear? And in the 1930s, Bertrand Russell, Pivio didn't mention this, I happened to come across this in my reading. Bertrand Russell said that when you look at a diagram, all the elements of the diagram and their relationships to one another, that's to say the meaning, a schema, a schematic organization, is immediately available to the reader, which is the equivalent of Pivio's simultaneous or synchronously offering itself. But Russell says, goes on, if you want to express and explain those connections in, he actually said concatenation, a string of words, writing or speaking, then you have to use a level of syntax which adds complexity to your processing. So when I'm on a course, I invite teachers, and it's not an accusation, to inquire whether there may be parts of their curriculum whose explanation verbally may be more complex than the very concepts that they're trying to explain. And then, you know, the behaviorists, when they were dealing with rats and mice in mazes, asked, and there was a furious debate about whether the mice learned like a sat-nav, left, right, right, left, 2 lefts, or actually did they somehow helicopter above and arrive at a cognitive map? We'll answer that very shortly. We should have a look at Alan Pivio in his book I mentioned, Mental Representations. Have a read of that. Saying something very strange, not something that people normally pick up with what he said. So we have early toddler infant experiences that are sensory, and we're going to develop this, these motor expressions of our body and movement in space, we retain those experientially, and later psychologists will argue, and I'll explain their argument, that it is essential for our cognitive and abstract thinking. So these metaphors, kind of what are they? George Lakoff has this list. So he explains, one way that we can explain thinking is we consider it to be as if we're moving. You know, I'm leading you through an argument. I'm presenting you and you're accepting it. I'm taking you step by step through my thinking. When children are toddlers, they consider, and linguists have looked at this, they consider seeing to mean knowing. So when you hide something, you reveal something, and then you reveal it. To see is to know. And the two terms are equivalent, they mean the same thing. But later, as they develop, they understand that they're different, and yet it retains that link. So we talk about, do you see what I mean? Can you see the point where it's illuminated? The same argument goes here. I'm going to talk a lot about objects very shortly. We talk about, do you grasp the point? Do you collect your ideas? Do you arrange them? Do you know, there's all these things that we do. And if you look at presenters, we're all gesticulating as if we're expressing what's internal, ordering ideas. And then of course feeding, which is really, you know, I just was thinking about online learning with students. We talk about bite-sized learning, easily digested. So, you know, we have all these ways which are physical based on our early infant experiences. It seems like they are essential in order to express complex ideas. Now, Lakoff and Johnson, in this book, of all the metaphors we use, those that are most related and fundamental to thinking are spatial metaphors. Now I'm going to show you, in January, I gave a presentation at Teach First conference, and I had to attend a front. I was attending some of the opening speeches, and they weren't directed to me. I wasn't bored, I wasn't directed, but I took out my notebook, and in a 5-minute spell, I'll say seven, but it was 5. The key speaker used all these metaphors. It was Reuben Moore. It's a great speech. He's a great guy. I really enjoyed it. And in 5, in reality, it was 5 minutes. Look at them. Look. Just read those. How could he or any other person convey the meaning they want to convey without using these metaphors? This is the sea, this is the water that we swim in. So by metaphors, we don't mean rhetorical flourishes. So English subject teachers, I'm not talking about that, and we're not interested in the fine distinction between a metaphor and a simile. It's all analogy, really, from terms of psychologists. We're going to continue and use the word metaphor. So from metaphor, from this book, developed the study of image schemas, and I'm very shortly going to tell you what that is. Rather confusingly, I'll let you know it's neither an image nor is it a schema. It's something toddlers learn early on in life, almost like a principle, a logic, as they understand what the world is. We'll discover that very shortly. And it also was the start of a whole discipline of embodied cognition. And I let you know that last year John Sweller included it in a factor in cognitive load, just in case I'm taking you too far on a flight of fancy, because some of you only believe the men with numbers, you know, so it's already there, believe it. So now I want to talk about my grandson, who I saw at Christmas. He came over from Singapore, he's 1 year old, and here's what I noticed about him. He's just obsessed with objects, as indeed all toddlers are. Objects, they're infinitely interesting as they play with them, they knock them, they beginning parts of constructing, they load them up, and they also do something else with the objects. They put them inside containers. I mean, not as neatly as that. They have all sorts of containers. They put them in, they put them out. How many can they get in? How many can they get out? Can some objects be partly in, partly out? Some containers have particular shapes, so the object has to fit the container. And very shortly, I'd realized that my grandson, Harry, his world is full of containers. In fact, he is constantly in a container. And that container has a door, and it's called a room. And in the evening, my daughter puts him in a smaller container called a cot. And throughout his life, he even begins to realize that he's a container. Because inside a container with food, he picks it up and he puts it inside this end of his container, and it comes out the other end of his container. So we're obsessed with containers. The world's just a container. And by the way, to show you how sophisticated it is, he does something that Aristotle would be proud of in his categorization theory. Subsumption, superordinate and subordinate categorization. He gets a container and he puts a smaller container inside a bigger container, and that inside a bigger still container, and it continues till you might have half a dozen containers nested inside each other. The very concept of nested knowledge, and I've accidentally switched to containers, also have wheels, and so he's also obsessed with a path. Technically, those of you who are into the academic will know that that's technically called source, path, goal. So when he gets up in the morning, when he's no longer in his cot or he's sitting down, you notice that he's at the source and he has the goal, which is over there. And in order to progress along that path, he needs effort. Force takes him from the source to the goal along a path. And these, as we'll very shortly see, are the very cornerstones of abstract thinking. So let me introduce someone who I'm totally obsessed with at the moment, Barbara Tversky. She's been researching visuals in all sorts of disciplines as a cognitive scientist for over 4 decades. Yes, and she was the wife of Amos Tversky. And she's now brought together some bits of research that allows her to more powerfully express what she's known about for 4 decades. So instead of having tiny bits of research, it put it together in this coherent schema. And this is her expression of it. The mind regards objects, ideas as objects. So what I just showed you, if instead of objects, they were ideas and we put them in a container and we push them towards the goal, you'll see how that pretty much covers most of our thinking. Back to John Sweller, just to reassure you, Okay, I won't say any more, just to reassure you, you need to see his face and the word cognitive science, it reassures you. Now, Efrat first. She pointed out on Twitter very, very recently that there was an article in a magazine. And by the way, Efrat's got a wonderful blog explaining really coherently the link between cognitive science and neuroscience, and really responsibly, you know. And this is the article that she pointed to. It comes from Quantum magazine. It's in my book, by the way, if you want to catch it. The brain maps out ideas and memories like spaces. There it is, there's the quote, made bigger for you. I hope it's beginning to come together. So this thing about metaphor, the metaphor's based on our embodied experience of space. And now, and then we talked about rats and how they get this cognitive map of where they are. And we discussed intellectually whether ideas are non-linear, but they're linear when we express them. And we're always interested in schema now, which we know are non-linear. We don't have paragraphs in our head. And now the neuroscientists are saying something really remarkable. The way the brain maps out objects in space may be the self-same mechanism by which we map our ideas. And this is what they showed. So I think we've all heard of the hippocampus, and you know how it's plastic. You may have heard about some experiments in the 80s or 90s where London taxi drivers, before sat-nav, had to learn the knowledge. They had an enormously larger hippocampus because they, as it grew in response to the amount of knowledge they had to retain. Well, right near to that is the entorhinal cortex, and this was the subject, won the Nobel Prize. So it's serious stuff. And here's what it discovered in the entorhinal cortex. There are place cells where when we walk around in our environment, like it gets logged on. You know, we're scared about monitoring now with the coronavirus and the app. We monitor ourselves. It's as if we digitally monitor where we go, and it gets logged on in us, in our mind, and this is how we remember where we are. It seems, and there's a growing number of agreement between neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, linguists, and others, that this explains a lot of information. So now to complete this map, from this book, Metaphors We Live By, we had the idea of image schema. And image schemas are what I talked about, infants playing with objects within containers and paths. And they have this logic. I want to tell you this particular logic. So my grandson, Harry, if I present to you horizontally two emotional states of Harry, Harry is happy and Harry is sad. And I present them horizontally, but I ask you to put one or the other on a vertical axis, so one is above the other. Does happy come above or below? Does sad become above or below? If I were there with you in the room now, because I know you'd all be saying happy is higher, I'd say to you, and I almost ask each of you individually, how do you know that? Who taught you that? Who sat you down and said, listen, this is how it works in the world. Happiness is higher than sadness. Lower down than sadness is depression. Lower down is death. Higher up is godliness. And then you get transcendental states. Who taught you that? Who taught you that when you come home and you hear the news and you hear the Dow Jones is up, and if you're an investor, you know, you slump a bit? And who taught you that slumping is a correlate of your emotional being? Who taught you these things? You taught yourself, because you realized as a toddler, when you had a big jug of water and you filled a cup, you noticed the logic that the more the cup was filled with water, in other words, the higher the level, the more water there was. So up equals more, higher status, lower status, lower equals less. So these are image schemas. This is the water that we swim in. They can almost completely help you conceive, explain, and communicate concepts. So essential for teachers to know. And that got another side of that is embodied cognition, and that's now included in cognitive load theory. So you see, it's really, really significant, and we're getting more practical now. Now I'm going to show you a teacher. In a minute, I'm going to show you what she says. And I want to ask you whether you think, I don't know whether you remember, I spent nearly all my life in special schools and latterly a head teacher of a special school, of an SLD school. Is what the teacher's saying, the concept, not her means of communicating, her concept, is the concept she's about to say something that I could teach in my special school? I mean, I did A-level English Lit. That sounds like A-level stuff to me. Let me tell you underneath it what that looks like. By the way, I want you to concentrate now. I want you to consider, well, no, let you do it instead of me. Scan those words and tell me which of those words are metaphors. And I'm not talking about rhetorical grand flourishes. I'm not talking about Boris Johnson's speech. I'm talking about really simple metaphors. Right, let me tell you what they are. Central. That's not real. It's a metaphor of something physical. Pretty much every time you read the word in or any other preposition, it's a metaphor. Because you're talking about ideas as if they were objects. The next one is peripheral. Edge. Outside. So here we have a container. Are you ready? That container represents the canon of English literature. So this is a proper Venn diagram. By the way, I'd have a square around it to show the context. So if I introduce Voltaire or André Gide or André Malraux, the great French writers, they're in the outer box of great writers, but they can't be in this container because they're not English. And so in the middle, because we do consider central to be more important, in addition to up-down, we have center-periphery logic. We've put Shakespeare in the middle because his central is more important, whereas Joe Orton, he's a peripheral figure, literally on the periphery. Some would argue he's outside. Call that literature. That's all that was said. That's all that was said. So containers, Lakoff and Johnson again. Categorization gets really simple. Venn diagrams get really simple. We're going to link this very shortly to graphic organizer, so hold on, we're nearly there. So Lakoff and Johnson. There are two essential types of schema. There are others, but these are two really essential. There's the container model and the path model. For those of you who like to read the academic papers, you'll understand that path is, when you look at it, it's source, path, goal. I've just shortened it to path. So there we have. And that's just some of the language relating to that we use. And if we didn't use, we couldn't explain concepts and categories. It would be almost impossible. Almost impossible. So I was going to leave this to the end, but I'm going to introduce it now. I want you to entertain the possibility not only that the mind regards ideas as objects, but as teachers, which is to say as human beings, when we explain something, it's as if we're describing a diagram. Otherwise, why do we use those metaphors of space? Central, peripheral, on the edge, inside, outside. Similarly so with a path. Listen, conceptually, there'll be no such thing as educational assessment. There'd be no such thing as appraisal and performance management without the path model and the language that goes with it. The language that goes with it. None. It would be void. We'd have nothing. So I know for decades and decades we've said that the work that happens in early years is fundamental for later cognition. I think now we're getting a really zooming into the detail with a number of professions showing us exactly what that means. Exactly what that means. Okay, so thank you. So we've landed now. That was like a flight of unfamiliar territory and language and thinking. Now we're getting to how can we use that for the correct visual. So I want you to retain that it's about the visuospatial. It's about spatial metaphors. And it's not about the surface graphic details of graphic organisers, but of their underlying structure. We're looking at knowledge, how human beings construct knowledge now. So there are four main categories of graphic organisers. Let me place them within these two schematic models. We define stuff, we chunk things, whole part, whole relationships, and there's a number of graphic organisers within them. The biggest problem with graphic organisers, no one's organised them. There's no theory, there's just a list of inordinate number. So we'd never get any, we don't get really clever about it. So we define stuff. And then when we got two things, we compare. So we have two definitions up against each other. And there are a number of others. The path model, we have sequence and we have cause and effect. So temporal relations, causal relations. Just to let you reassure you that this isn't just Oliver making stuff up. Let me show you the degree of agreement we have over a few decades with different people. So I picked up a book in a library once by Cooper called Think and Link, and you'll see the same, before we start, let me go backwards. Pearson and Deno wrote a fabulous book called Semantic Organisers for Special Needs in America, and they themselves came up with a primary distinction. Schemas, and therefore graphic organisers that represent them, are either stasis, things are static, or they change. So there we have container and path. So it's the same distinction. So back to Cooper. So you see mine. So you see down below, you can link it with what I had chunk. Classification, you could have chunks, just a 70s word for classification, could be define, you get compare, match them up. Our own Ruth Walker, a couple of years ago, wrote a fabulous blog in which she came up with these categories. So that's contemporary subject teacher. Mark Sarno, the most underrated researcher, I think, in the UK. His book, 2001, was the first evidence-based teaching book that was pretty much ignored in England. I had no idea why. And then we went to Hattie instead of this more practical guy. Don't know why he missed our comparison. I've looked through, I couldn't find anything about it. David Hiley, some schools I know follow his thinking schools structure. Same idea. Oh, the great Ted Ragg, fabulous book about explaining. Again, I didn't find anything on comparing, but I'm sure it was in there. And Bernie Mohan, those of you who are teaching English as a second language, his wonderful work has the same things. So it's not just Oliver. So there we are, the four main types of graphic organisers, I think intelligently classified under these two main models, which fits in with metaphor fits in. And so here comes our test. Oh, it's contemporary. So I don't know how you're going to answer this, but I want a three-part answer, and I'm going to model question number one for you. The 3 parts will be, I want you to read the question, and I want you, this is really hard when everyone's so clever and things happen so quickly, I want you to put slow-mo on your mind. And I want you to tell me which word or words trigger, signal for you whether you need to look, it demands that you're thinking of a container model or a path model. And the 3rd part, which would be a graphic organizer under the chunk, compare, sequence, or cause and effect. So it's keyword, container or path, and then which of the 2 types of graphic organizers within them. So this is me. What exactly is the current coronavirus? The word that gives it away, there are 2 words, is what and is. What and is the key words that to me shout out, I'm talking about something. If we have something, I need to know what's inside it and what's outside it. So it's a container. And then if defining, I'll use chunk. So I would use any number of graphic organizers, there will definitely be a boundary. It's the boundary that defines the nature of a container. Now you, I don't know how long you take. We're nearing off our time together. How did the previous SARS virus play out? Read it to yourself, do it slowly. Which words? I know you get the sense automatically, but slow it down. Which words play out? Oh, I've said it there, play out, play out. So play out is like, play out means something happened, and something happened, and something happened. The denouement, the sequence of events. So it's obviously a path. And it didn't ask you to explain it, just what happens next. And then, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then. Number 3, in what ways is the current coronavirus and SARS similar? Which word shouts out? Container or path? And particularly shouts out which of the 2 within it. For me, the word is similar. To use the word similar, we've got to be looking at 2 things. And of course we are. On the one hand, there's coronavirus, and the word and is also a useful signifier. And the other one, SARS. We've got these 2 things. Which way are they similar? So we're looking at container and we're looking at compare. Obviously, you don't need to work hard now, but I'll talk it through anyway. What impact did the SARS virus have on the global economy? You remember when I was defining a path and Harry getting up in the morning, here's the source. He's got a goal where his toys are and there's a path. And the only way an agent, a subject, an object can get from source to goal is with force. And so we look at the word impact and we look at the word on. Impact on is a path and it is cause and effect. How'd you do? You did well, I'm sure. So now we come to the end. And this seemingly bizarre statement, I hope now is a question of, Oliver, no big deal, of course so, of course. Of course, the way we hold, and that's another metaphor, the way we conceive of ideas. And now I can see all the language I use to express ideas of my curriculum subject are just metaphors for objects in space. Hope that makes sense to you. Really looking forward to your questions. I'm now going to come out of there and then we'll see. I'll stop sharing. Hi.
Thank you. Fantastic presentation. We've got quite a few questions coming in, but just on a practical point, a few people are asking if you could go the path model choices again.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've got time to show that slide again, or if you want to share it later.
No, I shall show it now. First of all, I need to share my screen, which is behind me. Share screen. So you have the container, which is also known as stasis. Content. You could say content process or static change. So that we have graphic organizers that define in various ways and those that compare. So you could also think of it as those under chunk or define look at single entities. And when you look at a single entity, it's a container because you're looking what's inside it, what's outside it. And within it, just like Harry putting one container within other containers, you get hierarchies. So the tree diagram and the mind map both have a little container within a bigger container above it within a bigger container. That's all it is. And then compare, you're in or you're out, and how are you in both camps? The path is, I'll talk a little bit about sequence and cause and effect. Britain's own first evidence-based teaching book was written by Jeff Petty in 2000. Again, pretty much largely ignored by largely ignored by schools in England in 2000. And I did some work with him, and he really liked this. He said, Oliver, I'm not sure students can get the fine distinction between temporal and causal relation. So that's interesting, because I've got a book about special needs for kids with special needs in America. And here, and this is what I do on a course here, I want you to imagine, or perhaps draw in front of you, draw a circle with the word B inside, and below it, draw a circle with the word L inside. And you've got to join those up with an arrow. And the type of arrow you draw will determine whether you link them up temporally, that's to say sequence, or causally. And you could either join it up with a skinny arrow, which represents and then. So B and then L. Or you can join up with a fat arrow, which represents consequently. So as if B causes L. Now, when I tell you that B is breakfast and L is lunch, you can see breakfast doesn't cause lunch. What happens is it's simply a sequence of time. So a skinny arrow joins them up, and that, very briefly, perhaps too reductively for some of you, represents a distinction between temporal and causal relations. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
So stop.
Perhaps we could share this particular slide afterwards. Someone asks, what about evaluate and assess? Would you have to nest objects? How would you do that?
Well, evaluate and assess are what you do after you've done something else. So if you evaluate something, you've got to define something, what it is. And then you'd have to define certain criteria. So what do we mean by beautiful? What do we mean by efficiency? What do we mean by productive? So we'll look at one thing, say we'll look at, let's look at retrieval practice. Define it. What is and isn't retrieval practice? And then you need to define the criteria against which you're going to judge it. You've got to define efficiency. What do you mean by efficiency? What do you mean by any other criteria? And then you would then make your evaluations. If you're evaluating, comparing two things, then after doing some defining of the terms you're using, you would use a comparison tool. So if you look at the cross continua, you can't see it now, can you? Cross continua, you could define it in a more holistic way. You're grading something. So comparing also gives you gradations. So you can say, I give it 0.2 as a 0.7. Why? Because defining the whole concept as a whole, 0.2 has only these components, 0.3 has these components, etc. So even with more abstract things, you're still going back to that.
Yeah, thank you. So someone says, as teachers, should we spatially organise the thinking or facilitate pupils to organise them?
That's really good. And this is something that's really interesting me, is when you look at educational research, there's so many tensions. So, for example, it's true, and John Hattie talks about it, and Mayo talks about it in his learning as a generative activity. When you generate something, it's more meaningful and you learn it more and it stays with you longer. And at the same time, Federick Reif says, novices can't organise unfamiliar material. So if you give unfamiliar material to novices, and that essentially, for the most part, that's what students are, they will organise it. If you give them the tools, they'll organise it, and they will organise it incorrectly. And if there's almost a golden rule, which we get from Engelman, is never let a student create a misrule, his American term for misconception. Because it's really, really hard to undo that misconception. So I guess the answer is, it is better if students do it, and novices can't do it. So new material teachers need to do it for you. They need to teach students how to organise. And here, and there are some schools that are already doing it, I can't think of any child I couldn't teach to look at material and they will be able to say whether it's a container or a path model. I could teach them it in a lesson. And within a container or path, they'll easily know if it's one thing I'm defining, if it's two things or more I'm comparing. You can see more difficult is temporal and causal relation, but you've got enough examples to show that. And humorous ones too. You can teach them that. And so therefore you've got the tools to start scaffolding. So then as students won't necessarily become expert while they're still in your class, but they'll certainly move along the path between novice towards expert. And at some point, the teacher makes a judgment that they can then start generating or developing the initial core map or structure.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Someone's asking, how would you define the distinction between dual coding and this visual argument that you've made today? Because they say that it seems that the line has been blurred somewhat.
Yeah, and I'm kind of responsible for that in some way. I thought it was, when I first did the dual coding book, I was well aware that Pivio didn't research this, yet he wrote about it. He just stuck with simple retrieval, word and image pairing. It's fine, it's powerful, but it only plays a small part. Later psychologists developed the idea. Sweller talks about dual mode, Mayer talks about multimedia learning. And I thought the word dual coding, even though it may not be totally precise, I think it was practical enough catch-all phrase. In other words, what I'm saying, outside of the academic discipline, I saw no beneficial difference it would make to make fine distinctions between dual coding, dual mode, multimedia learning. So the word dual coding, and obviously as Adam Boxer pointed out, it's the student who does not the student, it's the recipient of the communication who does the dual coding. But then again, whilst that's accurate, you know, we don't necessarily tut at teachers who say, I'm doing retrieval practice. No, you're doing teaching. Only the students are doing retrieval practice. You know, life would get really bored if we were really that pedantic. So whilst it's true, teachers don't do dual coding, they're doing a dual coding bracket practice. That's kind of understood and we don't need to say it each time. So for me, I see no danger in considering it to be dual coding. As long as I point out that actually it was Simon and Larkin and others who have developed it since. Otherwise the teacher gets confused. Am I doing dual coding? Is it dual mode? When is it multimedia learning? When is it visual explanations? When is it, you know, and all those distinctions make no difference other than confusing teachers. I can't see any benefit to them. They're fine when you write an essay, but outside that world, it makes no difference.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. If we apply these to curriculum mapping, rather than a massive Excel document with core knowledge statements, would a more visual representation be more accessible? Are there any useful tools that could be used?
Yeah, a couple of provisos all the time. An Excel spreadsheet, is very efficiently placed in a container. If you were to start creating maps with them and then you put icons in, you'll create something enormous and complex and concentrated. And actually, even though I immerse myself in the visual world, there's lots of visuals I just don't want to read. My first response is, ugh, because I'm lazy, I just don't want to work hard. So I think that what I found for educators, what's beneficial is the initial stage, for which I think post-it notes or sticky notes, one of the greatest cognitive aids we have, is you get a big wall, everyone stands up, they look at the wall, and then they map everything out. So externalizing your thoughts into a visual, non-linear arrangement is really brilliant for discussion. That then gets formalized into an Excel spreadsheet. And then the third stage, so we got construction by dialogue, aided by the externalization of non-linear connections, then the formalization of them on an Excel spreadsheet, very condensed. And then the third stage, if you want to communicate them, then it's up to you to decide which of them need a diagram. And I don't use visuals very much in my life. I don't need them because I can read words and I can understand them. So I can understand when you first start, teachers do get enthusiastic and like anything they can get their hands on, they'll visualize. Every icon they can get hold of, they would use. I understand that. And there's just an initial phase of enthusiasm. Later on, you'll realize I've got 4 design guidelines and one of them is just restraint. So just use it when you need to, and when you do, just restrain the amount of colors and typefaces and icons and everything else. So it's not a question I can answer, is when you think your written or verbal explanations don't really hit home. In other words, people are just nodding. And if you need, just like Tom Sherrington asked so well with regard to Rosenshine, test them that they've understood. If they haven't understood, then consider, well, actually, maybe that needs to be externalized. It's an answer only you can answer, you know, not me.
Thank you. I think the idea of metaphors has really struck a nerve with many people. It's quite interesting. Lots of people commenting on the use of metaphor in that we use all the time, and how that might be very difficult for EAL learners, for autistic students.
Well, I remember explaining this to a teacher whose son had autism, and she says, that's why every time I say, let's go down to town centre, he knocks down the floor. You know, literal. And almost every preposition dealing with a concept is a metaphor. Yeah. I really want to get through this point. I want to arrive at, you know, all the time. So you can see it kind of makes sense now. Consider the possibility. What I'm saying isn't true. Consider the possibility that when we speak, it's as if we're describing a diagram. And so sometimes if you think that's just too complicated, just draw the damn diagram just to support your verbal explanation. By the way, diagram to support verbal or written explanation. Standalone diagrams, I don't understand many of them. Too concise, too many private meanings. I don't understand what icons mean. They're only a support. The most powerful thing is teachers' words as they speak. If it supports it, great. If it doesn't, don't use it. They're always a servant.
You see, that's incredibly powerful, because at the moment we see a lot of resources being created by teachers trying to do really well, and they are so overloaded with different icons and such graphic organizers. It can be quite confusing. Thank you. So someone is actually asking, would you, for such children that we talked about, should we be teaching these types of common speech metaphors discreetly to these children? Is it worth it?
The thing is, I don't know. I really don't know. You know, I'm reading increasing bits of research about it. I told you from linguistics and neuroscience, but I haven't seen anyone else like me in education pick them up and saying, wow, this really explains how we think and explains how we explain. There's got to be something useful that comes in with some research about that. I'm not sure necessarily it would. I think it could confuse children, and I think they may become too hyper-conscious of what they're saying. They'll almost trip up over each other. But I think it is useful. If you're going to use graphic organizers, then I think you're giving a concrete expression to what could seem like a flight of fancy. So when I say in, can you see it means within, without? So the other thing was that, you know, I did this 20 years ago. And when, do you remember in primary schools, I forgot, secondary school, we did text genre, you know, genres, how do you say it in English? And there were whole language related to these 4 types. So they naturally align together. The types of language that go with define, you're talking about attribute, part of, within, whole, you know, inside, outside, peripheral, central. I think that's a good time to introduce that language, because it's powerful language anyway when you're doing a diagram. And so if for a child, they can see those words mean something with a diagram, you can then use them. So I think essentially what I'm saying is we're using diagrams to improve language.
Yeah, that's
the aim is language.
Yeah. Right, Oliver, I think oh, it's 12, it's actually past 12, so we're going to have to stop now. I do have quite a few other questions. Is it okay if I send them to you?
Sure.
see if you have any time to address any of them. Thank you very much for your presentation this morning. Not only was it really, really clear, but it's actually really, really challenging in places and very thought-provoking. So thank you very much. Oliver mentioned Efrat first. She's actually presenting on the 18th of June, so stay tuned for this one. Yes, it's going to be a really, really useful one. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow at 11. Thank you, Oliver. Bye-bye. If you want to, yeah.